Hello and welcome once more to this microeconomics course. Today we've talked in this section about the price system and the theory of the firm, specifically talking about demand and demand elasticities. We're now going to move on to supply, changes in supply and the factors which affect supply, the theory of supply, elasticities of supply and its determinants, demand and supply interacting together, price controls, taxes, consumer surplus and producer surplus, and finally finish on quite a large section about market failure if we get that far. If it goes on a little bit and runs on a little bit, it'll be in the next lecture. So then, supply. Supply curves and the law of supply notation. A supply curve curves upwards from the origin, outwards from the quantity supplied, and upwards in terms of price due to the law of supply. There are two examples in front of you of supply. As you can see, it extends straight out from the origin in a straight line, therefore a straightforward supply. There are two examples there, one of which is extending an extension of supply. The other is an example of contraction in supply. From the extension, we'd extend from P to P1 and Q to Q1, going up the supply curve as denoted by the arrow. And from a contraction in supply, we'd move down the supply curve from P to P1 and Q to Q1, as denoted in the bottom right. Changes in supply. If other factors change other than price, more or less product is available to market at every price. This is shown by a shift in the supply curve known as a change in supply. This would be reflected in the diagram shown, in which you can see clearly a fall in supply will be a shift from S0 to S2 with denoted effect on quantity and prices charged, as an expansion in supply will be from S0 to S1, one being a shift to the left, the other being a shift to the right. Less supplied at each price for a contraction, and a shift to the right being more supplied at every price. Changes in the conditions governing the supply, resulting in shifts in the supply curve, are numerous. Among possible causes of change in supply, we would include weather. Harvests of agricultural products may increase the yield if favourable weather has occurred. Similarly, harsh weather conditions may result in lower yields. Disease. Crop and livestock disease may affect the supply conditions, both in the short and long run, for a primary commodity yield. Refer to cobweb theory later for a more in-depth explanation of this, and we'll be coming to that in a later module. Progress or improvements in technological achievement. Technology improves the yields from the mixture of capital and labour inputs. If you remember from an earlier module, you'd note that the inputs that you can have in terms of factors of production vary: capital, labour, land and enterprise. The simplest example in the Western world are improvements in communication technique, resulting in improvements in productivity and output per hour, represented by shifts in supply to the right. The average cost of production in consequence fall. Changes in price of factors of production. Increasing wages, raw material price, fuel and power, interest rates and rent, for example, all can reduce supply by increasing factor unit average costs. This may shift the supply curve to the left. Changes in the price of competing products and other commodities. Assuming our product costs structure and pricing structure remains constant, then if because of demand increasing the prices of other goods and services increase, production of these goods and services becomes more profitable. Therefore, in consequence, resources are reallocated through the market mechanism to produce more of these products. With a fixed amount of resources, our production products look less appealing and are less attractive to suppliers. Should the goods in question be substitute goods, then the price of the goods may fall following an increase in supply of another good, such as petrol and paraffin. Indirect taxation and subsidies. Indirect taxes add costs to production per unit. Therefore, when prices increase, as they are required to pass on a proportion of their profits to government, the supply may become restricted. Changes in the number of producers. War, acts of God or unexpected events. These may temporarily reduce the supply of key commodities, for example oil in the 1990-91 Gulf War. It is possible that the supply conditions of one good may be wholly dependent on the combined consumption of this good with another product. This situation is known as one of joint supply. Here, the change in supply of one product will change with the availability and supply of another. A classic example of this is that of beef and hides, and this is represented on the diagram in front of you. Here, an increase in the demand for beef in the beef market leads to a shift in demand, and more being demanded at higher price. An increase in the quantity of beef increases the supply of cattle hides, flooding the market, leading to a fall in equilibrium prices as hides are the skins of cows. The price elasticity of supply. The price elasticity of supply measures the responsiveness of supply to a change in price. The percentage change in the quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price is therefore the price elasticity of supply. Most products have either an elastic or inelastic supply. An elastic supply means a situation where a percentage change in price causes a greater than proportional percentage change in supply. Conversely, an inelastic supply is where a given percentage change in price results in a smaller percentage change in supply. It's worth noting that any straight line supply curve drawn through the origin has unit elasticity of supply, which would intersect with the price axis is price elastic, which would intersect with the quantity axis is price inelastic. This can be shown very simply. Degrees of elasticity of supply and other less common extremes of elasticity. If you look at the top left graph first to begin with, you'll find that it has a supply price elasticity of 1. The supply curve below it also has a supply price elasticity supply of 1. And that's essentially because, as we've discussed, it's a straight line going straight through the centre of the origin. The graph below it, directly, price elasticity of supply is greater than 1 in the top instance, and therefore elastic, with it cutting through the price curve, which is a simple way you can tell from just glancing at the diagram. Similarly, supply beneath it is inelastic, with the price elasticity of supply being less than 1. The top right graph shows a perfectly elastic curve, supply curve, with elasticity of infinity. Change in price would lead to an infinite change in supply. If you imagine a producer cutting price to increase supply, there's no way that would be represented on any graph. As a consequence of that, it is referred to as an infinite elasticity. The bottom right has a perfectly inelastic supply curve. A change in price has no effect on the quantity supplied. That's reflected, as you can see, by a change in price from P0 to P1, not adjusting the quantity in any way at all. Now I'd like to move on to price elasticity of supply determinants. The extent to which supply is elastic depends on the flexibility and mobility of factors of production. Among the factors that influence the degree of elasticity of supply of production include the level of space capacity in the industry. The more capacity there is in an industry, the easier it should be to increase output if industrial prices increase. The number of producers. The more producers, the greater the ability of price responsiveness. The level of employment and factor mobility. The easier it is for factor resources to move into and out of an industry, the more price responsive the industry can be. In a situation of full employment, the more price inelastic an industry will be. The ability to and ease of storing stock of a product. Supply will be elastic if a product can be stored. In short, if prices rise, existing stocks can be used to satisfy temporary demand increases into the long term. Should prices fall, supply can be reduced by adding to stocks. Whether products are agricultural or manufactured. Agrarian products, supply is short run inelastic, as the quantity supplied per year is governed by the land sowed per season. This combined with the long growing periods to maturity, therefore an increase in the short-run demand would lead to sharp rising prices. Pastoral and husbandry products have similar issues. Time required to increase productive capacity. Manufactured products elasticity depend in part on production times, which can be improved through investment in the production process, meaning they tend to be more price elastic. This, however, varies with bulkiness of product, e.g. pin manufacture versus aircraft wing manufacture. It's much easier, as you can imagine, to invest in increased production of pins than it is the complexity of an entire wing of an aircraft. Time period in question. The longer run will be the most responsive to changes generally in price than the short run. However, as a famous economist once said, in the long run we are all dead. Momentary time period, defined as the period of time in which supply is restricted to that capacity already in the market. The short period is that time which elapses before additional supply can be added to existing capacity. Short period in some industries, such as shoe manufacture, has a short period of a matter of days and can be handled through overtime. House building, on the other hand, can maybe a matter of months in terms of short period. Changes are shown as movements along the supply curve. The long period is thought as the period of time in which taking on board additional factors of production to access increased capacity can increase existing capital base, extend land, and adopt new methods of production. Two diagram sets to understand the period of supply are in front of you. The first we'll attend to now shows the momentary, short run and long run. And in summation, it takes time to move from the short run to long run period. The time taken to do that depends on the changes that occur in all factors of production. This varies depending on the conditions we've already discussed. It may be either a year, for example, in nuclear power, or weeks or months, for example, in terms of a retail outlet. Momentary period turns into short-run supply and long-run supply from a perfectly or purely inelastic state, momentary immediate supply, through to a very elastic long-run supply.